again, everyone. This is Jason Reece, professor at OSU, and I am following up with an optional lecture for week 3, which is a 2-part case study of exploring the aftermath of the process of redlining here in cities throughout Ohio, and the aftermath of redlining, looking at the trajectory of 3 different neighborhoods, but one in particular in Columbus that was redlined in the 1930s. We understand that the growth in recent literature on kind of the long-term trajectory of neighborhoods that are redlined, that there are a whole variety of kind of detrimental outcomes that we've seen documented longitudinally in neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s. Just kind of paraphrasing a few of these studies here, first noting that the majority of those neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s are still low to moderate income today, 74%, according to research done by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And also noting that redline areas have the highest rates of social vulnerability today in a second study done by NCRC. We've researched around the 2008 housing crisis that identify kind of patterns of recent predatory lending or subprime lending in kind of building up to the 2008 housing crisis in the 2000s that actually overlapped quite neatly with redlining maps in the 1930s in various cities. So therefore, we see kind of a continuation of housing distress and also kind of more predatory lending in the context of neighborhoods that were historically redlined 70 years prior. And then more recently, we've seen a variety of different studies come out, particularly from the field of public health, that has looked at kind of contemporary health disparities in relation to traditional redlining maps. And we see everything from more extreme heat events to increased lead exposure, higher rates of chronic disease, more prevalence of mortality, lower life expectancy, more food insecurity, and greater exposure to violence in terms of contemporary conditions in neighborhoods that were redlined. So it is very clear that the Hulk maps done in the 1930s captured some aspect of the phenomena of structural discrimination that faced neighborhoods in the aftermath of the 1930s in this period of redlining. My case today really looks at 2 particular aspects of redlining. First, trying to get a better understanding of what factors really informed the area assessments. And this is from a content analysis of the written assessment documents for all Ohio cities that currently have available assessment documents. And the second is to look at kind of trajectories of neighborhoods that were redlined, particularly in the Columbus area, specifically looking at the Bronzeville community, which at the time, during the 1930s and 40s, was really at its peak in terms of being a very economically vibrant community and really home to a home place in terms of the economy, culture, et cetera, for the Black community here in Columbus. First thing I want to note is that when we talk about redlining, we have to think about Hulk and redlining activities as really a window into the racist norms of the real estate industry in the 1930s. This image here, screenshot, is from the Hulk assessment done for the city I grew up in, the industrial city of Hamilton in southwestern Ohio. And as you kind of read through the context of who actually informed the map, you begin to see that these were actually not necessarily government agents working, flying in from DC on behalf of the federal government, but actually were real estate professionals, and many of them operating for many years in that particular housing market. So as you think about kind of the forms of discrimination that you see written into these whole assessments, recognize that this is really a window into the minds of real estate professionals in the 1930s which allows us to see the pervasiveness of racism, nativism, and also anti-Semitism in the context of the way real estate professionals viewed different communities and viewed the influence of different types of households in the context of neighborhoods. And as we note here, even the local president of the real estate board, right, is involved in the context of the assessment for this kind of mid-sized industrial city in Ohio. So again, as we think about these documents and try to understand these documents, remember that these documents were heavily informed by local real estate practitioners. And what you're really seeing is a mirror into kind of forms of discrimination that were in the housing market, the norms of racism that were in the housing market during this time period in those local communities. I'm going to start with our content analysis. And this was a project where we looked at all of the cities in Ohio that still have full assessment documents. These assessment documents are page by page documents, one page for each neighborhood, that have a variety of different contextual boxes for folks to kind of write in their comments in terms of various aspects of neighborhood condition. Do note that Columbus and Cincinnati is not included in this particular content analysis because those Polk assessor documents have been lost and never recovered. But we are covering most of the urban areas in the state, and our content analysis really looked at understanding how many references were in the documents in relation to individual neighborhood characteristics. And in particular, were the documents referencing social characteristics more, physical characteristics of the neighborhood, e.g. something like industry, physical characteristics such as like housing or infrastructure, or geographic characteristics. Is this neighborhood close to something detrimental, or is it close to something beneficial, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is one of our final content analysis bar graphs from the city of Hamilton, also where I started our discussion today. And this is a trend that we see kind of hold up across all the different city assessments that we have done, where really the social characteristics kind of make up, particularly for the areas that were given downgraded, the C and D areas. Social characteristics make up most of the written references in the context of these particular assessment documents. While we do see kind of things like physical characteristics of neighborhood, built environment characteristics, for example, or just geographic conditions referenced, but more likely to be referenced in the context of A and B areas, or areas that were given very positive ratings by the assessors in the 1930s. So, two takeaways from this. One, recognizing that in terms of understanding kind of the written documents and the motivations that are kind of put forth in the written documents for why a neighborhood was graded the way it was, we will see a mix of both kind of social characteristics and also built environment or physical or geographic characteristics in regards to neighborhoods. But I do want to emphasize that particularly for those neighborhoods that are redlined, we see social characteristics really kind of being the most kind of common references in justifying or explaining the decision to downgrade those neighborhoods in terms of the assessment score. So I'm going to start with thematic analysis of just looking at some of the primary themes that come out of our green and blue areas on our Holk maps. These are those areas that are more positively rated, with, of course, green being the top rating, or as you look at the map's key, the green and blue areas correspond to A and B grade ratings on the Holk maps. So the first thing to start with is that we do see a number of land use policy and planning references in the context of these positively rated areas. We see land use references, particularly references to forms of residential exclusion, not necessarily referencing zoning, but in many cases referencing restrictions. And from our analysis, we find that those references to restrictions are often referencing restrictive covenants or other types of restrictions on who can use certain public facilities. So we'll see phrases like well restricted or highly restricted being given as a justification for why this needs, in particular, an A-grade rating. We also see some planning references, but in general, these are related to kind of more landscape characteristics within the context of the community, with many of these kind of A-rated neighborhoods, A-graded neighborhoods, kind of a testament to just the love of the garden suburb during this time period. As assessors kind of went on in terms of describing these kind of landscape characteristics that they considered ideal in terms of residential neighborhoods. We also, though, as we, not as often as we see in areas that are rated C and D or downgraded, but we do see some references to the social characteristics in these upgraded neighborhoods. Generally, in terms of A areas, you'll see population references that really emphasize kind of the professional class or elites who live within these particular spaces. And in areas that are B graded, you'll see concerns about the concept of infiltration, which of course was a very kind of racially motivated construct that, or racially discriminatory construct that the infiltration of certain populations would somehow be detrimental to the neighborhood and be, in the end, cause its decline. And what I want to emphasize here is that these concerns about infiltration that we'd see expressed in these B areas were often referencing very small populations of, in particular, people of color or Jewish residents, or even more ethnic immigrant residents in this context. So as we see here in the context of Youngstown or Cleveland or in Warren in this case, examples such as a number of, or a small number of Black children walking through the neighborhood to attend a school was somehow seen as a form of infiltration. Or in the case of Warren, where we see just the existence of a Slavish Catholic church is recognized as potentially a sign of infiltration and somehow a detrimental feature in the context of this neighborhood. So we began to see kind of very clearly the way that, particularly in this context of infiltration, we see different forms of nativism, anti-Semitism, and racism begin to get expressed in these documents. I want to pause here for a second as well and to acknowledge that I am using the original source language from these documents and recognize and acknowledge that this is very painful language and very challenging language. And so I do want to recognize that and also acknowledge that we want to present the context of these policy documents as they are, so that as students and as learners, you can get a real, very candid view of prevalence of discriminatory and racist norms in industry and in these policy documents during this time period. Unfortunately, this is a part of history that has long been whitewashed, and our efforts here are really to bring forth the evidence of this time period that helps us understand the ways that racism in particular was such an embedded norm in the context of real estate planning and development. From here, I want to transition into our yellow and red zones, which are, of course, our areas that received the lowest grades during this time period. And so as we kind of look at these yellow and red areas on the various maps throughout the state, and we analyze those assessment documents, a number of kind of key themes kind of come out in this context. Generally speaking, what we find is that downgraded neighborhoods are generally seen in close proximity to services and certain public amenities, such as schools or transit infrastructure. Occasionally, you will find references to kind of infrastructure problems, but this is not the norm. Occasionally, you will find references to housing problems, but again, this is not a universal condition found across these assessments. And finally, where we do see a land use issue that comes into play, and this certainly links back to our expulsive zoning discussion that we've had in week 3 as well, is the role of industry seen as a very detrimental influence. Even rail lines, the existence of rail lines were seen as a detrimental influence because of the kind of connection between rail lines and heavy industry from that perspective. But as you kind of saw in the content analysis that I presented for the content analysis bar graph that I presented for the city of Hamilton, the overwhelming kind of comments in the context of neighborhoods that were given C or D grades really pertain to the social characteristics of these communities. And we see kind of very kind of prominent themes in the context of what social characteristics are used to justify downgrading these neighborhoods. The first, and of course, most prevalent would be racism. And that in fact, neighborhoods that are given D ratings in some cases had very or relatively small African-American populations during this time period, but still that was enough justification in the context of the assessors to downgrade the neighborhood. Of course, xenophobia during this time period. Very strong kind of nativism push. So fears about, in particular, Eastern Europeans, the kind of generically kind of vague and threatening term of foreigners invading, the mixture of different classes in terms of the Jewish population or Italian population. And again, kind of what you see is a very kind of strong evidence of very intense kind of xenophobia and nativism in terms of how assessors viewed various immigrant populations. In regards to social characteristics, another primary theme that came out of the content analysis was a direct fear of intermixing population, right? Or influence of, or even in worst case scenario, low-class whites, as it's referred to in many of these documents, intermixing with other communities of color. And this form of kind of diversity in the context of a neighborhood was seen as a very detrimental thing. And as seen in the context of the quote from Dayton, this idea of intermingling between racial groups of the same class in particular was seen as very detrimental. And finally, anti-Semitism, which strongly comes out as a major theme throughout all of these documents. And as we got into in the week 2 materials, talking about restrictive covenants was another common theme that we would see in restrictive covenants during this time period. So the next part of this particular case study, I want to kind of focus in on the Holcomb map for Columbus, which is where I'm located, where Ohio State is located, and give you an idea of some of the different types of neighborhoods that were redlined in Columbus, how redlining kind of interacted or intersected with zoning in the city, in terms of how that map looks in contrast to our zoning map in this time period. And also to look at the trajectory of one of the neighborhoods in particular, which I referenced earlier, which is the neighborhood of Bronzeville on the Reece side. So again, to kind of walk you through the graphics here on the map, the key to all of these, the symbology in terms of the green and blue areas corresponding to our upgraded areas, our C and D areas, which are given our low, our 3rd and 4th grades and had the most restrictive requirements in terms of credit. And also to pay attention to the context of many of the undeveloped areas around the city at this time period, and kind of going in again to kind of thinking about Professor Pendel's lectures, as well as future discussions, and the influence of FHA in particular in creating segregation in new suburbs as they would emerge because of FHA guidelines during this time period. So again, as you look at the Columbus map, to note here, most of the core areas in the city are effectively redlined or yellow lined in this context. And really we see kind of the areas that receive improved grades primarily to the north, primarily to the northwest, kind of in the far west, and then in the far east And these, in fact, are representing some of our first generation suburbs that were outside of the city limits at this time period, heavily restricted via covenants during this time. So the first neighborhood I want to look at here is Flytown, and Flytown often kind of fits it really kind of fits the mold of what many people assume neighborhoods with redlining look like. It was a neighborhood that was predominantly low income, a mix of immigrants, primarily Irish immigrants, and the African American community, in a neighborhood that had serious built environment challenges, ranging from inadequate infrastructure to non-existent water and sewer to poor housing quality. And so as we kind of look at Flytown, and Flytown, of course, here is, if you know, kind of Columbus, is located right next to Goodell Park, just north of downtown. Flytown no longer exists, as it was destroyed for the 670 highway construction that would occur in the 60s and 70s here in Columbus. But as we look at archival photography of this time period, we do see some evidence, at least in terms of archival photography, of kind of understanding what some of the infrastructure challenges were in Flytown. Here, obviously, you can see although most of the city would have paved streets at this time, Flytown does not. Moving into our next image, just to note that Flytown had very challenging housing situation in terms of housing quality, but also in terms of basic infrastructure in the context of water and sewer. Just as you kind of note these photos here, the prevalence of outhouses that exist in the backyards, even though we're looking at a time period here where plumbing is much more readily accessible in most of the city, yet parts of Flytown are still basically not connected to sewer services. The next neighborhood I'll profile here is Steeltown. And Steeltown is a neighborhood that, again, is downgraded primarily for two reasons. One, its makeup of population, very heavy ethnic immigrant population during this time period, as well as a sizable Black population. Also, its proximity to industry in the context of Columbus. Surprisingly, housing conditions in Flytown were not, or excuse me, in Steeltown were not poor. Much of the housing in Steeltown at this time was actually relatively new, and was really kind of designed for more or less kind of the industrial working class who resided in this neighborhood at this time. So if we look at Steeltown here, again, kind of looking at some of the streetscapes, you'll see housing that was built primarily in the preceding 10 to 20 years. So fairly active kind of business community, particularly in terms of serving the immigrant communities within these neighborhoods. Steeltown was known in a contemporary time period is known as Hungarian Village because of just the large concentration of Hungarian immigrants who ended up migrating within this space. But as I said earlier, this neighborhood has always been known as kind of a gateway neighborhood in the context of immigration within the city, both seeing kind of immigration from Europe, immigration from African Americans moving up from the South during the Great Migration during this time period, and immigration from Appalachia, with many folks leaving Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, searching for industrial employment opportunities up in this neighborhood. And so while this neighborhood, of course, is very close to a very strong employment sector, housing is not that old, it is downgraded primarily because of its proximity to industry, but also the racial and ethnic composition of this primarily immigrant community. The next neighborhood we'll look at here is Bronzeville. And Bronzeville, again, kind of bucks the trend of this concept that redline neighborhoods were prominently or were primarily dilapidated or really challenged in terms of their built environment characteristics. And with Bronzeville, we see a neighborhood that gets the absolute lowest grade, fourth grade or a D score, so obviously red on the map, but actually a neighborhood that was quite strong, economically vibrant, in many ways was one of the healthier communities in the city during this time period, just in terms of the neighborhood conditions. What made Bronzeville unique was Bronzeville was the hub of Columbus's Black community during this time period, but was also a racially mixed neighborhood with Jewish residents, also some immigrant folks still living in the community at this time. There would be a substantial amount of wealth in the Bronzeville community, particularly Black business owners and other Black professionals who lived and worked in this neighborhood, and often owned businesses in this community as well. So just a snapshot here of kind of the primary commercial business section here in Bronzeville. On today's maps, Bronzeville is also referred to as King Lincoln, which was a kind of contemporary name that was given to the neighborhood during this time period. But as you kind of look at this kind of snapshot of East Long Street, again, we don't see passive abandonment, we don't see dilapidated properties, we don't see businesses that are out of business. In fact, if you look at this particular sector, this was a very kind of strong commercial sector with many businesses owned by the Black community or the Jewish community, and was kind of a hub of both services as well as economic opportunities for residents within the context of these neighborhoods. Also very well connected to the greater kind of Columbus transportation grid via the extensive streetcar lines that connected the neighborhood during this time period. So looking at some of the housing stock, and while Bronzeville had certainly some housing, particularly in a sub-area known as the Blackberry Patch, that we had some housing that was more challenged, some of it somewhat dilapidated. The majority of Bronzeville at this time period is actually fairly high quality homes. And again, housing that's not that old in the context of the neighborhood itself. And this is just a kind of snapshot here of some of the more premier residences of Bronzeville during this time period. And again, a reflection of kind of the wealth that was in this community at this time period. Finally, as we talk about other kind of critical services, the image on the right is St. Clair Hospital, which was a hospital built for the Black community by leaders in the Black community. A hospital that was active for quite a long time in the context of the neighborhood. On the left-hand side, we see a social services center for African-American women who have recently arrived to Columbus as part of the Great Migration. And so again, recognizing that there were really kind of critical essential services in this neighborhood during this time period, particularly for the Black community. I would also note in the context of Bronzeville that if you look at the, of course, historically famous Green Book, which was the directory of businesses in areas where African Americans could travel safely across the US, most of the references in the city of Columbus are actually located in the Bronzeville neighborhood in the 1940s or in the 1950s, et cetera, et cetera. Also, as a reflection of just kind of the intensity of the culture within Bronzeville, Bronzeville at this time was probably the hub of arts and culture in Columbus, particularly for the African-American community. On the left-hand side, you see the Lincoln Theater, which was built by Bronzeville residents and investors, and a recognition too that some of the kind of best musicians, jazz performers, blues artists, et cetera, had actually came to Bronzeville to perform, including some of the top known musicians of the time. And finally, just a snapshot here as we kind of talk about sense of community. Again, kind of looking at Bronzeville, sort of snapshot of Bronzeville in the late 40s, early 1950s. And again, you see a neighborhood that is certainly not it's showing any kind of physical distress, very strong set of community assets and services, very strong business community, et cetera, et cetera. But despite all that, the neighborhood gets redlined during this time period. I also mentioned that we can look at the kind of interplay between zoning and redlining here in Columbus. And what I'm showing you here on, I'm sorry for the image quality, it's a very old map. It's a 1937 zoning map for the city of Columbus, very close to the time period that the Hulk map would be made for the city as well. And as you look at this map, just to decipher some of the context of the different land uses, we'll see that all of our areas here in yellow and in white are areas that are predominantly single family residential, or at most two-family houses, or doubles as we refer to them here in the Columbus market. Areas that are seen in brown tended to be accessible for apartments. And then areas in blue, as well as purple, would represent the industrial land uses during this time period. Now, as you do look at the map in comparison to zoning during this time period, you do see some commonalities in the context of overall Hulk grades and really kind of what the zoning looked like during this time. Obviously, if you look at this kind of area, which is the Grandview Upper Arlington area, which is still one of the wealthiest areas in the city of Columbus today, this area was, again, zoned for single family residential at this time period. Same with the Westgate neighborhood that you see right here on the far west side was zoned for single family residential, as well as the Bexley community on the east side, which again is also one of the more affluent neighborhoods even in the 21st century here in Columbus. So certainly we do see a relationship between particular single family zoning in areas that are given A grades, as well as a relationship between different forms of multifamily zoning in those areas that are downgraded. And as you kind of look very neatly, many of these areas here in the map that are multifamily would be downgraded in the Hulk assessment. So what I want to reflect upon here as I close is to talk about the aftermath of redlining. So redlining activities, of course, happened in the 1930s. We know there's a bit of ambiguity in the context of how redlining maps were circulated and utilized after Hulk as an agency no longer exists. We do have evidence that they did reach a lot of local lenders and real estate professionals. They did certainly inform FHA maps in the aftermath of this. But what I want to talk about is the trajectory of the neighborhood. There is I said, what I don't want to present is that in the aftermath of redlining, a community like Bronzeville quickly fell apart, which was not the case. And in fact, there was too much wealth in the community and too many assets in the community for that to happen. But what would happen over the long term is the neighborhood would not be sustainable because of the restrictions that were placed on the community. In addition to that, we would see other kind of discriminatory policy decisions, particularly around urban renewal and highway construction, that would more or less kind of be the kind of final blows to the neighborhood, kind of triggering a very substantial decline later in the 20th century. So in terms of kind of wealth building, real estate and development in the Near East Side community and the Bronzeville community in particular, it's important to note that there are different aspects of discrimination in regards to real estate practices and development pre-redlining in Bronzeville, and those just lasted after redlining as well. And that the community's response to that, their kind of an effort to kind of be resilient in the context of that, was the use of internal financing structures to finance a lot of the development and real estate in the community. These internal resources came often from social organizations, Masonic organizations, and also in many cases, the leadership from prominent churches in the neighborhoods. In particular, the women's leadership in various congregations who would pool resources to help invest in various kind of real estate needs or developments in the community. So as I mentioned, eventually these locally generated resources are not sufficient over the long term. Fair housing efforts in the 1960s and desegregation efforts allowed particular the kind of upper income residents of Bronzeville that were African American to kind of move to suburbs that were further out on the east, kind of impacting what I would say would be kind of the, in many ways, stripping away a lot of business owners that lived in the neighborhood, as well as some of the higher income folks who supported a lot of the local businesses in the Bronzeville area. In tandem with this would be urban renewal's impact on the community and the neighborhood. So in the 1960s, the Columbus area enacted an urban renewal project called SCAR, is the acronym, which is a terrible acronym, but very fitting, which was a slum clearance and redevelopment initiative by the city. And the thing I really want to emphasize for you here as you kind of look at this map, one, areas that were targeted for urban renewal projects during this time period were almost exclusively areas that were either yellow or redlined in the whole map. But what I want to demonstrate here is this is the greater Bronzeville Near East area, and we see a definitive kind of targeting of that community. A lot of property demolition, the development of high-rise public housing towers during this time period, and other forms of urban renewal projects that in essence kind of further destabilized the neighborhood. The final blow to the community would be the expansion of the highway system. And as I noted earlier, again, just like our urban renewal areas, our inner highways fit neatly right over top of the redlining map for Columbus, just like they do in many cities. And in fact, of all neighborhoods that were impacted, Bronzeville and the Near East Side would be one of those communities that would be most devastated in the context of land loss, just as you see kind of the massive, this is just the interconnection of I-71 and 670 here, just the loss of housing, the loss of land to the real estate projects during this time period, and of course the severing or disconnection of this neighborhood from the heart of downtown, or the core of downtown, the city of Columbus. In addition to this, there were a number of local businesses that were destroyed, as well as kind of culturally important assets in the community during this time period. And so again, as we see the trajectory of Bronzeville, we see a neighborhood that was very strong and vibrant up until the 1930s and 40s. It's redlined like a lot of urban neighborhoods, but then devastated, particularly by urban renewal programs and highway construction, which in the long term kind of spun the neighborhood into kind of a longer decline in the later half of the 20th century. Bringing kind of all history forward, Bronzeville, as I mentioned, is now called the King Lincoln neighborhood or the King Lincoln district. And it is now a neighborhood that, although there are some signs of disinvestment, is now going through a transformation again. And now new fears of gentrification-based displacement are a top concern in Bronzeville, right? So we see a neighborhood that has been kind of impacted historically by many of these kind of structural policy factors, different aspects of discrimination. And we see that story kind of continue into today as we have conflicts over redevelopment activities in Bronzeville, what affordable housing is going to be left in Bronzeville, et cetera, et cetera. And will Bronzeville still be a diverse community in the aftermath of kind of redevelopment pressures of in upcoming decades. So thank you for taking time to listen to this Columbus case study. Hopefully this gives you some context of just kind of the way different forms of discrimination in the context of redlining informed Hulk maps that we look at, and then just at the trajectories of different neighborhoods in the aftermath of redlining in this context. So once again, happy to follow up with any questions. I also have some reflection questions here, just if you're interested. One thing, just thinking about what kind of factors influence the redlining grades, if you kind of look back at our content analysis that we did. And second, how did the process of neighborhood decline occur in neighborhoods like Bronzeville? What were mechanisms of resiliency in the context of those neighborhoods? And what were later kind of policy factors that further cause those neighborhoods to decline. Thank you again, and look forward to your questions in the future.